Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org. My name is Matt. This is a space where we explore various art-related topics, and in today's tutorial we will be looking at how to draw hair, more specifically how to draw female hair in a realistic way that kind of defines the unique textural qualities of hair and how it interacts with light and how that creates shine. We'll also break down the process through a variety of simple and digestible steps. So with that being said, let's get into it. Now, something to notice about hair, it's quite a contextualizing feature, so it kind of needs to be attached to a structure, in this case obviously a head. We don't necessarily need to worry about drawing features into the face. This isn't a tutorial about face drawing, but what we do want to do is start by drawing a general circle, which we will kind of define into a kind of face silhouette shape to establish the starting points from which the hair will merge from the top of the head. Now, when it comes to hair, it's quite an abstract looking feature, and what I mean by that is it's kind of hard to understand what is going on. But the best way in order to approach a hair drawing is to kind of think about your mark making the same way as you think about the actual structure of hair. And simplistically, to put it into a more simple and digestible way to understand, hair is just a conglomerate or a combination of lines stacked together, and that's what hair is. Hair is just these lines that flow from the scalp, and as they get longer they start to fall down the side of the head. Now obviously there's all sorts of hair types ranging from type 1 to type 6, type 1 being quite straight and then type 6 being quite coily. In this particular tutorial we will be looking more at a type 3 hair. It's more of a wavy like hair type that is kind of synonymous with a Caucasian female. But what we'll do is we'll look at how to create these kinds of curvatures in the hair structure as they fall, and how they start to form these groupings of hair that overlap one another, creating this dense and voluminous quality within the hair itself. Now, the way in which we can start is we want to basically work in some lines that flow from the scalp and start to fall all the way down the sides of the head, and ultimately forming this very natural, curvy, wavy quality within the hair drawing. But in order to do so, we first want to understand what exactly is happening with the hair structure as it gets long and then starts to fall down the sides all the way to the shoulder. Now, when hair is healthy, what is basically happening is it's quite voluminous. So when it sprouts from the scalp and it is quite short, it tends to stick up, especially in the case of a Caucasian hair type. Now, as the hair gets longer, obviously what happens is it starts to curve around the scalp and ultimately fall down the side of the head and continue to do so as the hair grows, and eventually fall to the shoulders. When hair has more wavy qualities within it, as it gets longer, it tends to also create more wavy like structures. And again, the way in which we want to kind of think about how to achieve these qualities within a drawing process, or the hair like quality within a drawing, is to think about drawing the hair as if we were actually drawing strands of hair. And this means that we are basically going to draw a series of lines that flow in a type of formation. Now, another thing we want to think about is, naturally, because there is a large number of hairs on the head, and as they kind of sprout from the scalp and start to fall downward towards the shoulders, the hair fibers will tend to group together due to the large number of hair fibers coming from the scalp. And what happens is we start to see these segments form between groupings of hair, which slowly start to establish these segmentations that curl in on one another, largely near the lower tip ends of the hair, as the hairs kind of start to separate from the scalp. Now obviously, because the hairs are kind of densely close to one another in the scalp region, they don't necessarily overlap or cross as much as they will once they start to reach the lower end or the tips. And this is because the hairs have an ability, or at least space, to start moving around and then kind of conglomerating or start to segment into these different sections. Now, as we kind of work with our pencils, the idea here is to kind of work in these curved lines, and we can allow these curved lines to flow down either side of the head in various directions. Some important things to note is that, again, when hair sprouts from the scalp, it's going to go up. So the way in which we define that is we create some smaller pencil strokes that flow from the scalp in an upward direction, and then we almost kind of creating a helmet-like effect that kind of runs parallel with the top of the scalp, which is going to define where the hair starts to curl in on itself and eventually fall downward towards the side or towards the back end of the head. So we want to think about the hair actually kind of growing out from the scalp in an upward direction and then curling towards the back of the head or towards the side of the head. And this is how hairs tend to kind of form from the scalp and then flow down the sides of the head as they get longer. Another thing that we can be a little bit more playful with is how much curvature we create within the long strands of hair. Again, obviously, because hairs kind of sprout from the scalp, they're kind of densely close together, and then as they get longer, they create these strands or segments that become a little bit more loose, which is what allows the hair to create these segments in the first place as they come near towards the tip end of the hair structure. Now, again, we can be really playful with how we draw in these curved lines. We don't necessarily need to follow a very specific format in drawing the hair. What is really nice about hair is it is an abstract kind of feature, which means we can get away with forming the hair in whatever way we like. In the case of Caucasian hair, in order to assist you with creating a more realistic quality in the hair, something to keep in the back of your mind as you draw hair is that hair obviously is going to have a reaction to gravity, and this is obviously uniquely the case with Caucasian type hair or type 3 hair and down, between type 1 to type 3 hair. And what this is going to do, it's going to have an effect on the hair, and the hair is obviously going to fall in a vertical like direction. Now, when hair is voluminous and it's been washed and it's quite thick, it tends to have a bit of more buoyancy and like puffiness to it. So it does have that voluminous and thick quality, but we do want to kind of achieve this falling quality, which is going to give a naturalistic and beautiful quality, especially when drawing Caucasian hair. Now, allow yourself to be a little bit playful with your pencil lines. You can create these curves, you can create specific segments and partitions in the hair, and the way in which we do this is from the scalp and from the sides of the head, we can start creating these outlines that kind of define sections or groupings of hair, and these can be quite thin or they can be quite thick. Now, the other thing to bear in mind that is the most important part of drawing realistic hair, especially Caucasian hair, is how light interacts with this structure. Now, obviously, hair is quite a unique structure in the sense that the variety or the density of hairs present on the head are going to create almost like a singular surface area, and it becomes quite glassy. So hair is actually made of this protein called keratin, which is a really tough protein and kind of gives a fiberglass and glassy effect to the hair, which makes it really capable of kind of reflecting light or creating this sheen that runs along the surface area of all these little hair fibers, and creates this consistent like sheen in certain areas of the hair. So this is something we want to bear in mind. Again, the process of approaching a hair drawing is to see the drawing process the exact same way as you do hair fibers. So in terms of creating the sheen-like quality and the shadow, we won't use something like a conventional shading method, but what I mean by that is something like smooth shading, where we build up layers of shading to define shadows in the hair. Rather, what we will do is we're going to stick with this idea of approaching the hair fiber qualities exclusively with line work, and by the utilization of line work, we will also strategically integrate these negative spaces in different sections of the hair, which are going to function almost as the highlights and sheen like quality within the hair structure. Now again, we really just want to keep in mind that hair is simply a combination of lines stacked together and kind of flowing in uniform in a unique shape, and that is the case for this. So before we start working in these darker details with our ballpoint pen, make sure you spend some time on your pencil sketch establishing the outline of the hair structure, how it forms along the scalp and flows down the sides of the head, and ultimately creates these segments that separate from one another and start to create these more loose flowing, wavy, overlapping sections within the lower parts of the hair structure. Now again, some important things to think about during your pencil sketch phase is that you really want to understand that the hair quality or the structure of the hair fibers sprout from the scalp in an upward direction. Naturally, as the hairs get longer, they start to curve around the head, and ultimately when they get very long, they start to create these curvy, wavy like qualities that flow down towards the shoulder. The other thing to think about is this is naturally happening in relation to gravity's effect on the hair structure. So we can create voluminous and curvy and wavy qualities in the hair, but ultimately we do want to make sure that they fall down the side of the head in this natural way. We also want to make sure that as we draw in the hairs from the scalp, that they kind of move upward and then curve downward, so they're not too close to the scalp, and this otherwise that's going to create this very unrealistic flat quality of hair, which is just not a naturalistic thing that happens with hair and how it forms from the head. Now once we have done this, we're going to start transitioning into using a darker medium. In this case, we'll use ballpoint pen. The reason why we use ballpoint pen, or why it's a good medium to use, is because it kind of works very similar to pencil. And what I mean by this is that with ballpoint pen, the ink comes out quite sparingly, which means we have a lot of autonomy and control over our mark making process. Another thing to think about is keeping some scrap paper nearby as you proceed with your pen shading process. The reason why we do this is to just kind of scratch out or get rid of any excess buildup of ink in the pen before we make some marks. Now, as we proceed with our ballpoint pens, we're going to follow a similar method of drawing as we did with our pencil. And the idea here is we're basically going to first start flowing from the scalp area and slowly start to outline these curly segments in the hair near the tips and the looser ends of the hair. Now again, obviously because the hairs get long and they start to loosen up near the tips, they start to create these segments. So what we want to do is we really want to make sure that we're outlining these segments and clearly defining them as their own sections within the hair. Now within these segments, we want to now start paying attention to where and how light would be present within these structures. So obviously the hair is going to be slightly more darker near the inside area where the hair starts to fall on the shoulders or around the neck, and that's because the hair is quite dense and therefore light struggles to penetrate those areas, as opposed to the outer sections of the hair, which would be a little bit more exposed to light. Now again, the idea is we're going to follow the same process as we did with our pencil sketching stage, where we start to just add in lines with our pen. So starting from the scalp, what we can do is we can start making these strokes of lines that kind of flow with the outline structure of the hair from the scalp, and slowly working our way down to the varied segments in the loose ends of the hair. Now obviously as the hair starts to become more loose near the lower ends of the hair structure and create these various segments, something really important to think about in terms of three-dimensionality is this quality of overlapping. Now the hair is all sprouting from the scalp obviously, but as it flows down and curls in on itself, some sections or segments will overlap other segments, and this is going to create shadowing on the segments that it overlaps onto or around. So what we want to do is, as we work in some pen lines, we want to be conscious of the fact that some structures or segments or sections of hair will be overlapping other sections of hair, and therefore they'll be on top and by nature of that, casting a shadow onto the structure that they overlap. So the idea here is to kind of follow the same pencil drawing process as we did before, where we add in lines. However, this time what we can start to do is we can actually start working on each segment of hair one at a time, where we can actually focus on adding in lines that flow within the confines of the outline of each of these segments. So we want to make sure that the hairs are flowing in a naturalistic way, which tends to be quite vertical, but obviously as these segments flow downward, we want to make sure that our lines aren't moving in any sort of horizontal direction, but are constantly flowing in that horizontal or downward direction. Now again, obviously we want to be strategic with how we integrate our negative space in order to achieve this highlight quality in the hair, and the way in which we do this is, for one, we want to understand which hair structures or sections are on top of other sections of hair or other segments of hair. And what is going to happen is those sections that kind of overlap into a more exposed area where light could hit the surface of the hair structure, that's where we want to start adding in some negative space in order to create this quality of highlights. Now the idea with creating negative spaces is that with each segment we'll find that it starts somewhere and ends somewhere, and the reason for this is because as the hair overlaps and reveals these sections, those sections will then get cut off by another section of hair due to that overlapping quality, which naturally will create kind of these unique shapes. And as we outline them with our pen, what we want to do is we want to kind of work lines within each of these unique shapes or sections of hair, and focus on one section or shape one at a time. Now we want to make sure that as we add in our pen lines, we flow with the shape of these sections. So obviously as these little segments of hair become revealed or visible as they kind of form out of other sections of hair, we want to make sure that as we add in our lines, they kind of flow with the overall shape of each of these segments. So if the segment of hair curves, we want to make sure that we integrate line work curving with that segment, making sure that we maintain this consistency of uniformity within the hair structure within each of these segments. Now, another reason why we do that is we also want to maintain that quality of flow and movement in the hair, and the way in which we do this is we want to make sure that our lines and the strokes we make in each of these segments remain uniform and flow within the outline of each of these segments. Now, what we can also do again in order to create this quality of highlights is we want to make sure that we leave a little bit of negative space within each of these segments, especially the hairs that kind of sit on top. The hairs that kind of form below or tend to kind of be positioned underneath the segments that form on top can be a little darker, which will ultimately create this quality of depth. So obviously as we add in these lines to create a not only textural quality but actual tonal value in the hair structure, we can make the hairs that fall underneath overlapping hairs on top of them slightly darker, and this is going to bring out this depth quality between the hairs that sit on top and sit below one another. Now again, something to really bear in mind when you kind of proceed with this process of using ballpoint pen in order to create these line qualities in the hairs, you don't need to press too hard. The mistake that is often made is pressing too hard too soon. So the thing with ballpoint pen or any pen mark is that naturally once you make a mark you can't go back. So you really want to make sure that you are building up layers very, very lightly, and this is the reason why we use ballpoint pen. Ballpoint pen, the ink comes out quite sparingly, and very similar to a pencil, it gives us a lot of freedom and autonomy over creating layers of darker marks as opposed to dark marks from the get-go. So we just want to make sure that we are layering lines and darkening them when they need to be darkened, as opposed to immediately pressing really hard on the pen and just making these super dark strokes. Now make sure you take your time going through each segment. You'll see that some segments are really thin and flow all the way from the top of the head, and these are generally strands of hair that form from the fringe or the hairline and start to flow along the side of the face. But then there are other segments of hair that pop out from the back end of the hair that sits on the shoulder, and those are generally the hairs that sit below the sections or layers of hair that sit on top. Now you want to make sure that we are really just slowly taking our time working on one side before we move on to the other section of hair or the other side of the hair that falls on the other shoulder, and just simply work through each segment one at a time. You'll find that as you add in these lines and gently and slowly add in these strokes of pen lines, you will find that the segments will lead you into other segments, and that's when you can start integrating new lines into new segments. And obviously this is happening naturally because the hair is conglomerating into these layers of sections or segments that overlap one another. So it is important to also think about the fact that because hair is sprouting from the scalp, it's sprouting not only from the top of the head but from the side of the head and also the back of the head. And this is why we get these overlapping sections or segments, as these different areas where the hair sprouts from will conglomerate together, and that's why they create these segments that kind of overlap one another or form from underneath other sections of hair. So we want to think about the layers that fall on top of the head or sprout from the top of the scalp, and how they will layer over sections of hair or segments of hair that form from the side and from the back of the head, and as they rest on the shoulder. So as you work through these different segments, you work in your pen lines, you take your time slowly building up layers from light to dark. You strategically integrate these negative spaces. Just take your time going from each segment to the other until you have completed one segment, then move on to the next segment. Now, as we start to transition to the other side of the head, where the other section or larger structure of hair falls on the other shoulder, something to bear in mind as we move over the top of the head, remember that the top hairs that actually sprout from the scalp are very exposed to light. So because these hairs are very exposed to light, we really want to be conscious of utilizing a lot of negative space or very light pen lines in these areas. Again, when you work in pen lines, just be conscious of the pressure you apply to your pen. You don't need to press too hard, and this goes for the entire drawing process, even in the darkest areas. You first want to really work in some soft, very faint pen lines, and you can slowly build up these layers and darken them by this layering effect until you achieve a tonal value that you are happy with. And this is especially true for when we want to create these more darker shadowed areas or sections of hair that fall under those top layers of hair that sprout from the top of the scalp. Now, again, some key things to think about as we continue with our pen shading process and transition to the other side is that, number one, the hair sprouts from the scalp in an upward direction and then falls. So we really want to be conscious of the fact that gravity has an effect on the falling nature of hair as it gets long. Number two, we really want to keep consistency within our lines and how we integrate them into these various segmented features in the lower parts of the hair as they become looser and start to overlap one another. We also want to think about the layers. We want to think about how the top layers will have an effect or a shadowing effect on the layers beneath those top layers, or the lower layers, or the inside layers. So these are things we really want to bear in mind as we proceed with our pen shading process. And then lastly, we also just don't want to integrate these really harsh marks from the get-go. We really want to make sure that we start with very faint soft lines and slowly work our way through each segment and then darken those lines as we go. And sorry, one last thing, we really want to be conscious of how we integrate negative space to create this quality of highlight. So wherever the light source is most present, which will be in the layers of hair that fall along the top, not the inner layers, as well as the hairs that form from the scalp or sit near the top area of the head, these areas are going to be very light. So we want to make sure that we work a lot of light lines into those areas, or if they are super exposed, we can actually leave some negative spaces to create that highlight quality in the hair. Otherwise, this part of the process is simply a matter of taking your time. You can also be a little bit playful with how you integrate dark areas and light areas. Again, the thing about hair is it's quite abstract, so once you understand those fundamental principles of light, continuity within line, how the hair falls in relation to gravity's effect on the hair, and how these create these segments and overlapping qualities due to the layers, you have this freedom to play around with how you form the hair, how you structure the hair, and overall how much or how dense you would like the hair to be. But otherwise, that is it, guys. This is the general process of how to draw realistic hair. I hope there were ideas, concepts, and principles that you can take into your own hair drawing and will assist you further in creating a more realistic hair drawing. If you found this video helpful, if it was of any value to you, please drop a like, please subscribe, and otherwise we will see you in the next video. Cheers.